Hey everyone, today we're going to be walking through the process of integrating OAuth authentication into our mini application. OAuth is a widely adopted protocol that allows external applications, such as our mini application, to request authorization for accessing private details in a user's account without needing their password. So, in simpler terms, if a user has a Google account, we can use that account to log into our application without the need for them to enter a password. This not only simplifies the login process, but it also enhances the security of our application since we're leveraging Google's authentication system to authorize our users. So there are many OAuth providers, such as Google, GitHub, Discord, Twitter, etc. Today, we're just going to be focusing on how to set up Google and GitHub. So let me show you how that looks like for the user process. So I just click GitHub to register, and it registered my account in the background, and now things are good. If this is the first time a user does this, there is going to be a, a redirect that pops up from that OAuth provider to confirm whether or not they want our application to access their OAuth provider to be able to log in. So that is that. Let me just kind of show you how that looks like in the database as well, how we set this up. So in our database, close this out real quick and zoom in. We created the user. We are also getting the avatar URL from that OAuth provider if they have one. We grab the email from that OAuth provider and we set the email verified to true. We're not using a password, so that's null. And I have this field in here called OAuth methods because since we're doing multiple OAuths in our application, I just want to be able to keep track of that for purposes that we'll see later on. So that is that. And we could also sign up with Google. Whoops, not log in with Google, but either logging in or signing in, it automatically registers the user if there was not an existing account. So yeah, you could either log in or register and the user's account will be set up. So now that we just created a linking, oh yes, we're also going to be doing account linking as well. So that's what just happened here. So now the user is able to both log in with their GitHub information and also their Google information. But not only that, if they ever wanted to register with just an email and password, they would be able to do so as well, as long as that email is the same and it's verified. So let me just type in a password. This, just go here, is test 2 1, and we sign up. It's going to ask us to verify our code. So let's just grab that here. Oh, that's actually from earlier. So let's just grab that and verify that information. Cool. Now, if we go back to our database, we see that we have a third OAuth method, which is the email. So, and we also generated a password for that user that's hashed. So that's how it's set up. We have a new table that we're going to be walking through to keep track of our OAuth accounts. And yeah, that is pretty much it. So we set up a few different things, such as the avatar, as I mentioned earlier. And if we were only to register with an OAuth provider, we hit the change password since they do not have a password. So we're going to be walking through all of that. The first thing we're going to want to do is set up 4 new environment variables, which is the GitHub client ID, the GitHub client secret, as well as the Google counterpart. These are going to be needed so we could do our OAuth authentication. And let's set up the Google one first, since that one is a bit more verbose. So to set up to acquire those Google information, you want to go to this website here, council.cloud.google.com. Let me just pop this in. And it's going to redirect you to this page, or bring you to this page rather. And if you would want to create a new project for this, for your application, so create a new project. I'm just going to call it this project. And I am going to switch to this project after it loads up. And after you create the project, you go to this OAuth consent screen again, and you want to click external, click create. You set up the name for your application. So I'm just going to say Lucia example, maybe 3 at this point. Add your support email. You add the homepage for your application. You close this out. And you add your authorized domains. Now, this would be your actual domain. It needs to be a legit domain rather than the local host that we have here. So mine's is not, so I can't really put that since I don't have a domain for this application. So I'm just going to leave that as is, but do set that up for your application. And finally, you just add your developer contact info. So that's pretty much it. You could go through the scoping and see. Don't really set up anything for there. You could add a test user if you want to, and then you just get a summary at the end of everything that you set up. So now we go back to the dashboard. We go to credentials tab this time, and we want to click create credentials, and we want to select Oauth client ID. You're going to want to set the type of your application. This one we're doing web application, and you could assign a name for it. I'm just going to do something generic for this one. And you want to do the JavaScript origin IDs. Now this one is, let's see what I set up for my Lucia Auth example. We could just edit that. So you could have that as your domain. And then this one is very important, the authorized redirect URL. This URL is a server GET endpoint that's going to handle our authentication process for Google. So how that works is when the user clicks the link, it's going to send them to one server endpoint, which is this file right here. And it's going to create the authorization URL. And after that, we're going to redirect them to a new URL, which is within our callback folder here. And this endpoint is going to handle the whole authentication process. So that is what this URL is for. And then once you have all that information in place, you click save. When you first do this, it's going to generate give you the client ID and also the client secret. You copy that, you pass it into those environment variables. And now let's set up for the GitHub. So for GitHub to acquire that information, you go to your settings, scroll all the way down to developer settings, and then you click OAuth apps, click new OAuth app, and you set the name. I'm just going to say test. You get the homepage for your application. You could add a description if you want to. And for this one, you also want to set up a proper callback URL for that endpoint. So this is it right here. You click save. You copy the client ID, paste that into our environment variable, and you click to generate a client secret and paste that in as well. So after you got all the information, you click update application and you are set. So that is the process to acquire those environment variable information. Also, I'm going to delete all of this once I am done. So no worries. Next, we want to navigate to our schema.cs file and make a few updates there. The first is we're going to remove the not null function from the name field because since the user is going to have the option to sign up with OAuth, they're not going to need a name. And we also added the avatar URLs field. This is not necessary. It's just for aesthetic purposes to give the application a bit more flair. And also in an actual application that might be useful to your user so they could be able to identify which profile they're using for that application based on the image. And other than that, we also want to remove the not null function from this field as well, since they have the option to do it with OAuth, so it's not strictly necessary. And we have a new field called auth methods to store all the different ways that the user is able to log into their account, since we have account linking in place. And this is just a text, but with a type of array, so we could push things in there. And other than that, we want to create a new table to store our OAuth accounts. The first field is the user ID. to reference the user. The next field is the provider ID, which is the name of the provider. So Google, GitHub, etc. And the provider user ID is going to be the ID of that user from that OAuth provider. And then finally, we have a primary key, which is combining the provider ID and the user ID to make it unique. And that is it for our schema. After that, we want to go to our Lucia auth.server.cs file. And from there, we're going to want to create two new instances for GitHub and Google. And these instances are coming from this library right here called Arctic. It has utility functions for OAuth. So be sure to install that first. It's just pnpm Arctic, and you're good to go. And it takes in, for the GitHub, it takes in that GitHub client ID and secret that we created before. For Google, it takes additional thing, which is the GitHub redirect URL. So I just wanted to make sure that we specify that, and then we pass that in. And other than that, we made some updates to the attributes that we're getting back. So we want to get back the OAuth methods and the avatar URL. So we set those two things in place here. And then we also set the proper typing for them. Other than that, we want to also make some updates in our auth utils file. We want to create a constant for these cookie names, the Google, GitHub, and Google also has a verification cookie that we're going to be setting as well. And let's get to the next steps. All right, so now we are at the meat of our OAuth authentication process. And to note that within the auth folder, I created a new folder called Oauth, and that is used to store all the different OAuth providers. I just think that makes it more manageable and organized. For each OAuth provider, we're going to be creating two server endpoints. And the first one is to create the authorization URL. So let's walk through this code here. Within the get function, we're first creating a state and a code verifier. Also note, most of this code that you see here is in Lucia's documentation. So you could either copy that from there or within this repo. So this state and code verifier, they're going to be used to create the authorization URL. And this is a function from the Google Auth instance we had created earlier from that library that I mentioned before. And we could also have the option to set up a scope. Now, this scope allows us to retrieve additional information for that user's object. So in this case, we're getting the profile information and also the email. After that, we want to create a cookie for the state value, as well as a cookie for the code verifier. And then once that is done, we want to redirect them to that authorization URL that we had created. And then in our callback function, we're first grabbing the code and state to make sure that we have that information, as well as the stored state and stored code verifier cookies that we had placed. So we first want to make sure that all that information is there and checks out. And if not, we error out. And if everything is good, we pass in that code and stored code verifier to this function right here to validate our authorization code. And that's going to return a authorization token. So we could be able to access that Google user's information. And we are getting the response JSON here. We're checking if that user has an email, and we're checking if that email is verified. The reason we want to do this is because we don't want to store a unverified user from Google into our database. So we just want to make sure that things are legit. Now, after things are verified, we make sure that that email is good. We want to check if that email exists in our users table. And if it does exist, then we also want to double check if we have an existing OAuth account, existing Google OAuth account in particular for that user. So we're just pulling that information based on the provider ID, which is just the name Google, and also the Google user ID, which is this property right here. If there isn't a existing OAuth account, Google account for that user, then we're first going to want to check the OAuth methods to say get the existing OAuth methods. And if there's not, it's just going to be an empty array. And we're pushing Google into that since we're going to be creating a account linking with Google for that user. So we're doing a few transactions here. And the first one is to insert a new row in our OAuth accounts table for that user. And we also want to update that user's I said we want to update that user's information, auth methods information in particular, since we are now including Google. And then we create a session to log them in. So this first part was if we have an existing user. And now if we don't have an existing user, then we want to create a new ID for them and do a couple of transactions. The first to create a new user in the users table and also create a new OAuth information for that user in the OAuth table. And we create a session and log them in. And if there was an error, oh, sorry, not an error, but we want, after all that is set, we want to redirect them to the dashboard page since they are logged in and they should be viewing the dashboard at this point. So throughout all that process of the try block, if there was any errors, we just want to be able to log those and error that out. So that's it for the Google steps. The GitHub steps is very familiar as well. It's just a bit less verbose. We're creating a state information and then using that to create a authorization URL. We're setting the scope of user email because we want to grab that email. And we're setting the cookie for the state and redirecting the user to the GitHub callback server endpoint. So within here, similar process as well. We're grabbing that information from the URL and also the cookie. We want to make sure that information is good. If that information is good, we generate a authentication token to be able to access that user's information. And we also want to get the user's email from a separate API call. I'm not sure why GitHub does it this way, but yes, we have to do two separate calls to be able to get the information that we need. So now we have two response JSON for the user and also the user email, the GitHub user email. And this is some of the properties that both of that object is going to be returning. We want to check if the GitHub user has a primary email. If not, then we want to error out. And we also want to make sure that that email is verified. We're checking the existing user again right here. If the user exists, we just want to check if they have a GitHub OAuth account. And if not, we're going to create that for them and then create a session to log them in. And if there is no user with that email that they gave, then we're just going to create a new user in our database and also create their GitHub information in our OAuths table. And we create a session once that is done as well. And we redirect them to the dashboard and just error out if there was any issues. And that's pretty much it for how we could do that whole authentication process with OAuth. And let's get to the next steps. So I just want to make one thing clear. For each OAuth provider, both of those server endpoints, the first one that creates the authorization URL and the second endpoint that receives that authorization URL and validates it and also proceeds to authenticate and log our user in. Both of these endpoints are used to log in the user and also register a new user. So it does two things at once. Just wanted to make sure, not at once, but it handles two of those processes. So I just wanted to make that clear. And now we want to update the plus page.server.ts file for our registration route. And this form action right here, it handles the registration of the user using their email and password. And the first update we want to do is if there is a user and they're using an email auth, we don't want to create a new user for them since they already registered with an email and password. Now, The only other users we're going to have at this point is either a brand new user or a user that has a OAuth account but no email and password. So we're creating a we created a variable or updated the user ID variable to first check if there's if it either takes a existing user ID. If there's not, then we're going to create a new ID for them. We're hashing the password as normal, and this is where we're doing the check. If there is no users with the email, meaning they're brand new, there's no OAuth for them or anything like that, then we're going to insert a new user into our database. But if there is a user, meaning that there is a user that is registered only with OAuth, either Google, GitHub, or something else, then we want to set a password for them since they want to be able to also log in with email and password. And either way, everything else is the same. We still want to generate a email verification code and send that code to their email because we still want to validate whether they have a legit email. And that is that. We also created two new components. They are used both in the login page and also the registration page. And these components, the visual for them, are these two right here, this divider to or continue with, and also the links to our different OAuth endpoints. So let's see how they look like in the code. So the divider is just some divs with some tailwind classes, and that's about it. And for the links to the different OAuth routes, we just have a button that is actually a link. It's just styled like a button, and it's using the route or get route for those endpoints, and that is it as well. So that's used both in the login and register page. And now for the register process, where they receive that email verification code and they go to the email verification page to verify that code. We're just doing a few updates here. After we verify that code from all the existing code up here, the new thing we're doing is we're doing this transaction since we're going to be doing two database actions. The first is we're checking if there's we're getting the existing user rather, and we're getting the OAuth methods for that existing user, and we're just pushing email in there. So we could easily know which OAuth methods the user used in the user's table and object. And then the second update is we're just including or setting and updating that OAuth methods field in our users table. And that is about it for the register page. All right, so we're almost done. We just have the login updates, the login page update to go through. And in the plus page.server.cs for that, the only new change that we did is this portion right here. And to walk through it. So remember in our database, we had updated the password field to be not required. So that means the password could potentially be null. So before we verify the password, we want to make sure that the user actually provided a password and they also registered with a email. They have the authentication method was used with an email rather. And if that's not the case, if the user doesn't have a password, it means that they registered with OAuth and we just want to return a error message to inform them as such. And then in the front end, we are only adding these components right here, the one that does the divider and also the OAuth button links. And that's about it. And then finally, in the dashboard, the only new thing that we're doing is we used to return only the user's username, but now we're returning the whole user object to be able to display some additional information as we see here, such as the user's avatar. And also, if there is no avatar URL for that user, it's just going to display their initial. So let me bring the code back up. In the front end for the dashboard, we have a couple of new variables. The first one is one to get the initial of the user's name if it is provided, and also to get the initial of the user's email. So we could use that as a fallback if the name is not provided. We are also checking if the user only used sorry, if the user did not use email as a auth method. And we're going to use that to conditionally display the change password button. So here, the other new part is we're using this avatar component from ShatCN. It generates an image and also a fallback if there is no image. And we are conditionally displaying either the initial of the name or the initial of the user's email. We're doing the same thing here as well. And then finally, this is the condition we set that if the user did not use email and password as their authentication method, then we're not going to display the change password since they only have the OAuth as a authentication method. And that is that. That is the end of this video. That is the end of this series. It was a bit long, but we got through it. So if you guys have any questions, if you want to see me make another video, please let me know and I will do so when I get the chance. You guys have a great day and peace.